example from the Old Testament of one who ruled over his own spirit. God made him a mighty ruler. David, a man after God's own heart. David wrote in 2 Samuel 23, "Thus says David, the son of Jesse, thus says the man raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. He will be like the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, like the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. Although my house is not so with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. This is all my salvation and all my desire. Will he not make it increase?" David shows us here what a true ruler over men is, or what he must first do. He must first learn to be just, David says, and he must learn the fear of the Lord. This is a constant process for all of us. We must be renewed in the spirit of our mind, right? Ephesians 4 says. If we get the attitude that we've already arrived, I believe this is where we either have lost rulership of our spirit or we're losing rulership over our spirit. David knew that his dependency was on the Lord's grace to attain to this call of greatness, this rulership. In this case, it was ruling over Israel. Could you imagine being called to be a king over God's people? The king. And he wasn't just any king. He was the greatest king besides Jesus, mentioned of as the example after his life. But David knew that he was going to be dependent upon God's grace. As he says here, I want to read this again. Although my house is not so, God made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. It's all my salvation, all my desire. Will he not make it increase? When I think about this, what David said here, what came to my mind was about how David was a worshiper. He stood in awe of God's mercy in his life. It even says that when Paul quoted it, and also Isaiah, that when somebody comes to the Lord, that they receive the sure mercies of David. David stood in awe of this mercy. We read this in the Psalms. He stood in awe of God's grace and power that was in his life. David saw his own unworthiness, as he says here, even though my house is not so. I recognize my failures. My sins are ever before my eyes. Right? He saw and had hope in the supernatural changing power of God in his life to accomplish these things that God had called him to in his life. This is really the key to having rulership over our spirit, over anything in our life. Crying out to God. That's why I love Brother Kevin's ministry name. Cry to God. And the longer you walk with God, the more you learn this concept of just crying out, pouring out your heart before him, especially when you're in a trial, difficult season. You're saying, God, don't give me over to this corruption here. It's too much for me, And even this rulership, when we're not ruling over our spirit, we're saying, God, lead me beside still waters, restore my soul. There's nothing like when God, though, brings things in order into our life by his grace. Nothing like that, like David was saying here. Will God not make it increase? Many of you know, and we experience it sometimes in big ways, sometimes in just small ways. But it's nothing like that. Blessing of the Lord makes a man rich, and he adds no sorrow to it. We have to do our part, though. God will always do his part. Amen. Next passage I wanted to read about David here in conjunction which shows how David had ruled over his own spirit in the time of trouble. 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, it says, "Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters."
There is a Redeemer, Jesus, God's own Son.